Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Glenara rests on the ancestral lands of the Bunurong Bunurong people and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and uphold the continuing relationship to land, waters and community. I extend those respects to all First Nations people. Good morning, my name's Ellie Credlin. I'm History and Heritage Officer at the City of Glenara, and I'm delighted to be welcoming you all to this live stream this morning with Geoff Armstrong. It's a pretty dreary Melbourne day, but I can smell spring in the air, so I'm excited about that. Geoff's joining us from Sydney today, so we'll get a weather update from there when I introduce him. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So there is the chat line. If you want to ask Geoff a question, you can use that chat line. You do have to be logged into a Google account or a YouTube account. If you'd prefer not to do that and you'd just like to send us a question directly, then please do so via history@glenara.vic.gov.au, and we'll get to all the questions at the end. Geoff and I will probably chat for about half an hour, depending on how many tangents we go off on, and then we'll open up the floor to questions a bit later on, and we'll get to all of them, I promise. So I'm very pleased today to welcome Geoff Armstrong to our live stream, as I said, all the way from Sydney. Now, I am going to have to look at my notes while I'm reading out Geoff's bio because it's quite extensive and very impressive. So Geoff has been in the sports publishing industry since 1989. He's worked on more than 100 sports books as author, co-author, publisher, editor, and researcher. Across his career, he's worked with the likes of Steve Waugh, Merv Hughes, and Ricky Ponting. Quite a good list there. Geoff was sports publisher at HarperCollins from 94 to 98, then worked as a freelancer for many years following that. He's also worked in television as a researcher for major sporting events. It's an incredibly impressive bio, but today we're here to talk about one of Geoff's greatest passions and interests, which is Phar Lap. So Geoff is the author and co-author of this book, which is arguably considered to be the definitive biography of Phar Lap. Phar Lap, the story of Australia's greatest ever racehorse. And he's also the story again, co-author again with Peter of They Shot Phar Lap, Didn't They? Which is a ripper of a yarn. The story behind Phar Lap's remarkable 1930 spring racing campaign in Melbourne. And it's that which we're here to talk about this morning. So the intrigue surrounding the alleged attempted shooting of Phar Lap on the morning of Derby Day 1930 in a quiet Glen Huntly back street, which is why we're here to talk about it today, because it has so many local connections. So welcome, Geoff, all the way from Sydney.
Good morning, and I can give a weather update. It's seriously beautiful here today.
Oh, come on.
It's a beautiful day for a walk.
You are in lockdown, so you'll get...
And provided the walk is less than 60 minutes, it's fine.
Wonderful,
and we have to wear
wonderful.
a mask, but that's all fine. That's how life works.
Well, enjoy it. I might try and get one in later as well. Mm-hmm. So first question, Geoff, where does your fascination with Phar Lap come from? Max Fresnel of the Sydney Morning Herald referred to you as a Phar Lapophile.
That's probably the nicest thing. That's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me, I think.
It's pretty.
It's a bit spooky in a way. Family folklore has it that my grandfather taught me to read with a form guide. And I don't think that's true, but my mother used to say that. But I do know that when I was very, very young, that I would go to my grandfather's house and sit in the front room with him and listen to the race. We used to listen to the races and watch the rugby on the television, and my parents thought we were mad that we could do these two things at once. And we talk about horse racing. And one of my grandfather's favourite topics was Phar Lap. Mm-hmm. And Phar Lap's actually a natural subject for a young person growing up, because there are so many mysteries to the Phar Lap story, and so many mysteries that have never been solved. And so I just lap it up, and now you've got this wonderful situation with Trove that you can spend your whole life going through newspapers from the 1930s, and there's just an endless fascination for me.
So this book was written before Trove was available. So have you then gone back and just found
yes,
more material?
It's really interesting, because when we wrote the book, the basic premise of the book is that the shooting was a prank, and that it was basically most likely a prank organised by the newspapers of the day to create a story. And we base that premise because it's a total mystery as to what happened. And you sort of look at every possibility and you think, no, it can't be because of that, because, you know, whatever, we'll get to all that.
We'll get to that, yeah.
But when you start going through the different stories, we found this fantastic story by a racing columnist. I think his name was Red Leap, and he wrote for the Swan Hill Guardian. And he just wrote cold in the 1930s that it was a newspaper prank. And it's really bizarre. Only recently, I can do show and tell. I bought this book, which is a biography, or it's the biography of Egon Kisch, who was a communist, a Czech communist, who came to Australia for a lecture tour in the 1930s. And famously or infamously, the Attorney General of the day, one Robert Menzies, tried to ban him from entering the country. And he became something of a celebrity because he fought it all the way to the High Court to be allowed to stay. But Kisch, after he left Australia, he wrote a book about his Australian adventure, and it's a very eccentric book. There's a chapter on bodyline, so he became a cricket expert, and there's a chapter on horse racing. And he wrote in his chapter on horse racing about Phar Lap and essentially said that it was a prank. And what happened with the whole Phar Lap story, which everyone's familiar with to varying degrees, is 2 years after, or 18 months after the Melbourne Cup in April 1932, Phar Lap died, again in mysterious circumstances, in America. And again, because they couldn't work out what killed Phar Lap in 1932, that sense of mystery and that sense of something sinister happening, and all those people who in 1930 said, well, no one would ever try and kill a horse, they were sort of, by 1932, well, yeah, they did kill Phar Lap. And so all these wild gossip and rumour about what occurred off Glen Huntly Road in 1930 on Derby Day, they've allowed to take hold. And over the last, 70, getting up to 80 years, fiction has taken over from fact. And now we have this situation where everybody knows that Phar Lap was shot at by, gangsters on Derby Day, and that Phar Lap was murdered by Americans in 1932, even though neither of those things are true.
Well, let's get to that. Let's get to that indeed. I think what we'll do is we might actually go through the event itself. So sort of what happened. And what I might do for locals, Geoff's not local, but did you come down to Melbourne when you were researching?
Absolutely. My co-author, Peter Thompson, is actually a resident of East Malvern. And he knows Caulfield like the proverbial back of his hand. And the two of us did many trips around there. And I do know those streets quite well. Good.
Well, I brought up a little bit of a map here. We might we'll map the story. So hoping everyone can see that screen there. So this is an aerial of, I guess, the crime scene. We know that this photo was taken somewhere between 1925 and 1930. And the date of the crime, of course, is 1925 and 1940, sorry. So we know that it's roughly what the area would have looked like in 1930. So Caulfield Racecourse is, of course, behind here. So a little bit further down, the Neerim Road gates are just there. And here we have the cinema, which is now the Woolworths, which many of you might shop at. Here we have Manchester Grove. Here we have the stables where Phar Lap was stabled during the spring racing campaign in 1930, belonging to Joe Cripps. So there was quite a large property called Beverley Lodge there, which is now being demolished. And here we have the crime scene. So let's talk through what happened on that morning, Geoff, if we can.
Okay, so Phar Lap went for a gallop on this is the morning, a Saturday morning of Derby Day. He did just a light gallop, as racehorses tend to do on the day of a race. And then his strapper, Tommy Woodcock, who was on a pony, and took Phar Lap up Manchester Grove. Now, this is the first part of the story. There have been allegedly all these rumours that Phar Lap was going to be shot. And yet, strangely, Woodcock felt quite comfortable to do this walk on his own, just he and his pony and the Cup favourite. So he walked them up Manchester Grove, which was the way they always walked. It wasn't as if he went a different way to try and avoid the rumours that people were going to get at the horse. But quite peculiarly, there was a car parked on Manchester Grove. And Woodcock, when he talked to the police afterwards, said it was very unusual to see a car parked there at 5:45 in the morning, and also to have two people in that car apparently reading newspapers. So that was strange. Woodcock kept going across Glen Huntly Road, and when as he approached the corner of Etna and James, he realised that car that he'd passed in Manchester Grove was following him. And so at that point, he got concerned. And when he got to the corner of Etna and James, he actually turned into the cross street, Etna Street, and hoped to get the horse into a backyard. But the house that he tried to get into was locked. And then at that point, the car came screaming around the corner of Etna and James. Reputedly, a gunshot cracked out. Phar Lap, the pony, got free. Woodcock was extraordinarily brave because he wouldn't have known whether this was a prank or for real. He hung on to Phar Lap. The pony took off, and then the car screamed off and then got back onto Glen Huntly Road and headed west to who knows where. And Woodcock, as fast as he could, scarpered to Joe Cripps's stables. Now, at the time, Joe Cripps's was not the only stables in this area. It was quite common for there to be other stables there. So it wasn't unusual for Woodcock to be walking the horse in this direction, and it wasn't as if he was the only horse on the streets at that time. But that's essentially what happened. And quite amazingly, inevitably, people came out because the gunshot woke people up. But within moments, the press were there as well. And it was Usain Bolt-like, the way, especially the Melbourne Herald, it was there in no time. And the story took off.
And that's quite unusual, I imagine, to have the press there. There's no social media. Things can't get out very quickly. So to have the press there very, very quickly would have been quite unusual, I imagine.
Well, the press would have had representatives at the racecourse watching the horses train, but these would have been track watchers. These wouldn't have been crime reporters. But and I'm sure it's been exaggerated exactly how quickly the press were there, but it feels like they were there within seconds. But the fact that they were there so quickly, and the fact that the stories that were then published in the Saturday Herald that day, they were amazingly. There were maps, drawings, photos. The press were there to when Phar Lap went to the track that day to run in the Melbourne Stakes. The press coverage was extraordinary.
I smell a fish. I just thought I'd bring this little picture up here, which is actually the cinema, which is now the site of the Woolworths. So the Studebaker, I think, would have been around about there, which is now, that's Manchester Grove. This is now the Woolworths. So the Studebaker would have been parked around about there on the side of the cinema. So there you go. So
the thing I would love to know, and I haven't been able to find out, was whether Phar Lap, because the newsreels would have been shown at the picture theatre. I would love to know whether Phar Lap was starring at the time, because one of the interesting things about sport and the media in the early 1930s, with the rise of the wireless and also the rise of newsreels, great sports people like Phar Lap, like Don Bradman, they became genuine media stars because it was a new industry. And it's why up here, people like Kingsford Smith and the Harbour Bridge, Phar Lap, Bradman, Bodyline in 1932, these sort of stories were blown up in a way major sporting stories hadn't been blown up in the past.
And a bit of context for that period, it is the height of the Great Depression. Things are pretty tough. And sports stars, including racing horses, took on a different meaning in the national consciousness, didn't it, in terms of giving people that boost?
Absolutely. There's sort of this myth has been spun that, people were having their last shilling on Phar Lap but the reality was Phar Lap in all his races was such a pronounced favourite that there was no reason for people to put their money on because they wouldn't make any. But the other reality is that it was a time of such great uncertainty. And what Phar Lap did, Phar Lap won all the time. Once he started winning, he just kept winning. And he gave people a sense of certainty that otherwise their lives didn't have. And I think that's really important in the story of Phar Lap and in the story of Don Bradman scoring centuries all the time. The fact that they did this during the Depression, I think it's one of the reasons why they've entered folklore so strongly.
Most definitely. So the next day, so when the detectives arrived on the scene, is it true that they didn't find any pellets? They did a sweep of the scene and didn't find any pellets from any guns. Is that right?
This is one of the most interesting parts of the story, because the perception is, and the final report of the detectives Brophy and Saker, was that the fence behind where Phar Lap was standing, the fence behind him was, littered with pellets. But the reality was that in the press reports on the Saturday and in the first police reports, which we got hold of, there is no mention of pellets. There is a mention of a wad being found on the ground, but it wasn't until the next day that pellets appeared in the fence. And quite bizarrely, there was only 1 or 2 pellets. There's actually photos were published in the press. I don't know whether it was the Argus or the Age, but they had photographs of the pellets in the fence, the 1 or 2 pellets. They were circled. Here's one, here's another one. And when we spoke to ballistics experts to ask them, given we were told what kind of gun was pellets were supposed to have been fired, the scene should have been littered with pellets. And our conclusion is, and it's hard to see any other possible conclusion, is that there were no pellets there at all on the Saturday when the police first checked the scene, and that somebody on the Saturday night or very, very early on the Sunday morning has gone in and essentially just planted a few pellets in the fence to give the papers something to put in their papers on the Monday.
Dress the crime scene. Why don't we go through some of the major suspects, so all the theories that were being floated around at the time. So one of the initial police officers on the site, Davis, I believe he thought that it might be bookmakers, but did the bookmakers have that much to lose if Phar Lap had a rip-roaring spring racing campaign? What's the deal with that?
But Phar Lap wasn't a good result for the bookmakers. That is true, because he was favourite from day one. But the reality is, people have said that the bookmakers were up for a fortune because Amonis had won the Caulfield Cup and then Phar Lap was going to win the Melbourne Cup. But in fact, there had been much worse years. There are numerous examples of bookmakers suffering much bigger losses than they did when Phar Lap won. And we studied the VRC's minutes, and actually only 2 bookmakers, official bookmakers, had to hand in their licenses in 1930-31 because of losses. Now, it is true that some SP bookmakers might have been facing serious losses, but the reality is that there are numerous other years where things were worse. And in the year of the police strike in 23, when Batali won the Cup, that was a hell of a lot of a worse result. And there was a horse called Revenue. It's a great name for a horse that takes thousands of dollars from the bookmakers. Won the Cup in 1901, and that result was a disaster for bookmakers. So, yeah, Phar Lap wasn't a great result, but the reality was that this double was always the favourite way. And there were opportunities for the bookmakers to cover their losses. That's what bookmakers do. So it is possible that a bookmaker had got himself into a really, really bad position, but it's unlikely that the bookmaking fraternity as a group were seriously hurt by Phar Lap's win.
You mentioned SP bookmakers there. What do you mean by SP bookmakers for those?
SP stands for starting price, and basically just about every pub in Australia had an SP bookmaker. And the industry grew, especially when with the rise of the race descriptions and the wirelesses in the 30s, to the point up here in Sydney, we had a Royal Commission into SP bookmaking in about 1937. So these were illegal bookmakers, and some of them were huge. And I think John Wren, who is a famous figure in Melbourne, I think he had a betting shop in Collingwood that was notorious, and that's going back much earlier than the 1930s. So there were SP bookmakers who had huge businesses, but at the same time they were very good at what they did. And it's hard to imagine that these outstanding SP bookmakers would have got themselves into a really bad position with Phar Lap, given that Phar Lap was the best horse in Australia for more than 12 months.
So that theory doesn't hold much weight, really, that it might be.
Not in my view, no.
Right. What about gangsters? I mean, the underworld of Melbourne in the 1930s was pretty notorious. We had Squizzy Taylor, who had died previously a year prior to this. So we know it wasn't him. If he was still alive, I reckon it would have been pinned on him. But what was the sort of gangster underworld world like in 1930? And could we blame gangsters?
Well, I think Squizzy Taylor burnt down the grandstand at Caulfield, I think maybe about 1922.
Right.
And you know, there were stories of horses being doped, and there was a couple of horses around this time where the suggestion was that they had been got at. So those stories are true. And the detective Jack Brophy, who was in charge of the Phar Lap investigation, he had made his name as a fighting or competing, if you like, with these notorious criminals. Brophy's assistant, Harold Saker, there's one fantastic story of Saker. Squizzy Taylor had been warned off. He wasn't allowed to go into the race courses. And one day, Harold Saker found him at Caulfield Racecourse and told him that he was taking him into the station in the city. And as they walked out of the racecourse, Saker was going to catch a tram. And Squizzy Taylor said, no, we're not catching a tram. I'll pay for the cab. And so they got the cab into the city, which is maybe that sums up the relative position of the police and criminals of the time. So sure, it's possible that there was some gangster element, but again, there's no real motive as to why they would want to kill or stop Phar Lap.
And you imagine that if it was a gangster, they wouldn't have missed, right?
This is where it almost becomes Wacky Races like. The gangsters, supposedly evil gangsters or, you know, professional marksmen in the Studebaker were shooting at Phar Lap from about, I don't know, guess 3-5 meters. And they had not just the four legs of Phar Lap, they had the four legs of the pony to aim at, they had Tommy Woodcock to aim at, and they missed everything. And they were pretty hopeless. If they were gangsters, they weren't very good at it. And that's, again, it's almost like the people who want to tell this story and say that it was an assassination attempt, there's just so many flaws to that, because if that's why, again, it comes back to this suggestion that there was some sort of newspaper prank, and that they actually knew what they were doing, but they were a bit slapstick about it.
Well, let's get to the media and let's maybe set the scene. I guess it was a time that the media was becoming a little bit more tabloidy, a little bit more sensationalized. There wasn't a lot of direct reporting. I think the introduction of the wireless radio sort of played a part in that as well. So your theory is that this was possibly instigated by journalists looking for a story. Tell us a bit about that.
When Keith Murdoch, Rupert's father, became the the head honcho at the Melbourne Herald in the early 1920s, he brought a new style of journalism to that paper, to the major papers of Victoria, of Melbourne. And the Herald became much, much more tabloid. And their first target, if you like, was the Gun Alley murder in 1921-22. And they ran days of coverage, front page coverage of really blowing up the story of the Gun Alley atrocity. And newspapers through the 20s across the world really became, as you say, much, much more tabloid. And the Phar Lap became, from the moment Phar Lap became the best horse in the country, he was sort of the perfect story. He was trained by a battling trainer. He was owned by a loud American. Had been bought for a song. So he was a wonderful story. And Phar Lap sold newspapers. And when Phar Lap was beaten in the 1929 Melbourne Cup, there were suggestions that he was not only poorly ridden, but illegally ridden. And again, these stories all make headlines. And then through the autumn of 1930, when Phar Lap was probably at his greatest and produced some absolutely phenomenal performances, his headline news. And then from the moment he was made Cup favourite in 1930, there were these stories run that he was going to be got at, and people started talking about, and this is the term they used, the Phar Lap hysteria. And our theory is, or what we believe, is that the media, and especially the Melbourne Herald, bought into this hysteria and decided to push it up just to another level. And they created this story. And I don't think the Herald did it. It wasn't as if they all sat around a table and said, we're going to create this hysteria. But we suspect that a small group, 1, 2, 3 journalists, decided this would be fun. And maybe they were just, if I can use the expression, taking the piss out of the whole thing and just creating this major newspaper event. And you then had this situation on the Saturday where, as I said, the Herald just went all their worth with the story. They had photographs in the paper, the last edition of the paper, of Phar Lap getting a police escort to Flemington so it could run in the Melbourne Stakes on Derby Day. And it was a huge story. And the measuring stick that I have to just how big a story it was is that the Australian cricket team had just won the Ashes in England and had arrived back in Australia. And Don Bradman was actually landing in Melbourne on the Monday. And the Monday, I think it was in the Sun, the Melbourne Sun, on its front page had a photograph of Bradman and a photograph of Bluey, the guard dog, who was supposedly guarding Don Bradman. And the two photos were of equal size. So for one day at least, Bluey, the guard dog, was exactly the same, of the same importance as Don Bradman.
Amazing. Before we get into what evidence we have to support the theory of it being a sort of journalistic hoax, could we just backtrack a little bit and talk about the days between the days that led between the Derby Day shooting and the Melbourne Cup? What happened to Phar Lap? Where did he go? What happened in those few days, and how did he get back to Melbourne and to the Cup?
Like everything about Phar Lap, there was a sense of mystery to it. So while they were at the Phar Lap got a police escort to the races on Saturday, and while he was Harry Telford, Phar Lap's trainer, was an owner because he was just leasing the horse at the time. Well, he was at the track on Saturday. He organised with Mr. Guy Raymond, who owned the St Albans stud at Geelong, that they came up with the plan of spiriting Phar Lap away to Geelong in the height of day, basically at midnight. And Phar Lap would then spend the Sunday and Monday at Geelong, where no one would know where he was. And then they would bring him back to Flemington on Tuesday for the Cup. So at around midnight, Phar Lap was hustled into a vehicle to be taken to Geelong. On the Sunday morning at Caulfield, a mare called Old Ming wore Phar Lap's blanket and galloped, and not one person was fell for that. And so there were these newspaper stories run on the Monday papers, which were essentially where is he? No one knew where he was. And no one was prepared to reveal where the horse was. And it actually wasn't until on the Monday night, Geelong was hit. I think all of Victoria was hit by this colossal thunderstorm. And it was funny because Phar Lap was stabled there. And when this storm hit, Woodcock, who was looking after the horse, he immediately assumed that this incredible whole army was attacking him, but it was actually just the weather. And then on the Tuesday morning, Phar Lap was then taken to back to Melbourne for the Cup. But of course, the story had to have one more element to it. The van that was taking him to Melbourne wouldn't start. And so we had this absurd situation on Cup Day where about an hour and a half before the race, nobody knew where the Cup favourite was. And it wasn't until, I think, about an hour before the race that Phar Lap arrived. And you've got this great scene in the movie, which is actually not too far removed from the reality of Phar Lap arriving. And I know in the movie, Phar Lap movie, Tom Burlinson runs down with the horse. It wasn't quite like that. But he did arrive remarkably late for Cup Day. And this is the thing that proves Phar Lap's greatness. I mean, racehorses like routine, and Phar Lap was just thrown completely out of his routine, and then he turned up on Cup Day and was just magnificent.
So What evidence do we have? So he got to the Melbourne Cup. He won that race, and we'll talk about that race a little bit later. But I want to go back to a bit more about what evidence we have to support the theory that it would have been a journalistic hoax. So the pallet suddenly appearing the next day. So the crime scene might have been dressed up.
Yeah, look, the evidence is circumstantial. It was basically a mystery, except for the odd snippet in the press that someone might have been responsible for the fact that it was a prank. Though admittedly, there are wire stories, and the Sydney Truth on the Sunday, the day after the shooting, put shooting in inverted commas, ran a story that said this was a prank, and that everyone who had heard about it at Randwick and Modern Rosehill Racecourse on that race day, they all believed it was a prank. That was the general belief. The fact that the media was involved didn't really come to light until a story was run in a very respected British magazine, the Bloodstalk Breeders' Review, I think it's called, which said outright that it was a newspaper prank. And the thing that makes as much sense as anything to us. What really intrigued us is when we looked at the police file, and the police file is remarkably scant. There is very little remaining in the police file that's held in the Victorian records. But there's this one groovy letter, and I don't know if you can see that, but it's written on, and it basically is a letter saying that one of the numerous letters that the police got saying that Phar Lap was going to be shot on Melbourne Cup Day, which never happened. And it also says that Amonis, the Caulfield Cup winner, was going to be shot on Melbourne Cup Day, and Amonis wasn't running that day. So it's actually a ludicrous warning letter. Of all the letters that Brophy and Saker, the detectives, could have left in the police file, it's almost absurd that that was the one that they left there, except for the fact that it's been ripped off the back of those newspaper posters that used to be put outside newsagents. And the thing is, on the back of it is part of the word Melbourne Herald. It's the ALD of the Herald. And what is interesting is that this is not the only, if this is what we believe it is, and we believe it's the police saying it's a hint that the Herald was involved, it's not the first time that Brophy had done this in police files, because the gun alley atrocity that I've referred to earlier, Brophy quite bizarrely left some hair samples in that file, and our theory is that he did it in the hope that those hair files could be analysed later to see whether they revealed something about the crime, because the person who was later executed for the gun alley murder, there is a feeling, the historians have said, that he was innocent, that he was unfairly executed. And there is a possibility that the newspaper pressure that Brophy fell under in 1922 led to that execution. And we just wonder whether Brophy deliberately left that Herald scrap of newspaper in the police file as a hint as to what actually happened.
So, I mean, Brophy and Saker received tons of letters, right? And this was the only letter they kept.
As is the way with all these things, once it's out there, you get all number of people putting all sorts of theories out there, and they would have received countless letters saying this is what's going to happen. And it's bizarre that they left only this one letter in the file.
And interestingly, in your book, you say Brophy and Saker's report ends this way, and I'll read it out. Certain information has been received by us regarding who is suspected of the offence, but owing to the fact that we have no identification, our inquiries have been hampered. This matter will be further followed up, and in the event of anything tangible coming to hand, action will be immediately taken. So no one's ever been arrested for this crime. And that's very much we're going to put that away and probably never look at it again kind of statement, right?
Yeah, look, this is one of the most intriguing parts of this whole story, is that it was front page news on the Saturday, it was front page news on the Monday and on the Tuesday. And after Phar Lap won the Melbourne Cup, there are references to it, but albeit only references. There's no more police protection for Phar Lap after he'd won the Melbourne Cup. And by the Thursday, the story's gone. There's absolutely no evidence that Brophy and Saker continued their police investigation after the Cup. And that's actually insane because Tommy Woodcock was on the pony with Phar Lap. You could argue that if the shooting was fair income, that it should have been an attempted murder investigation. And yet the police just let it go. Phar Lap's connections were happy to let it go. Everyone was happy to let it go. And the report that Brophy eventually put to the Police Commissioner, Thomas Blamey, is so succinct. It essentially says, we know who did it, but we're not going to bother following it up. And again, that leads me to think that the most likely people to have done it is this suggestion that it was people in the media. And of course,
and what was the relationship? Sorry, Geoff.
I was just going to say that if it is people in the media and they've basically pulled this stunt on the public, they wouldn't want the public to know they'd done that either.
Yeah.
So basically, I think that they kept it quiet as well. And if it only involved one or two media, that might explain why that story has never been widely reported in journalistic circles.
So police, it was a different time for police. Just following on from that thought, they were almost kind of like pseudo-celebrities, and there were very close links between celebrities and journalists to get stories, to report stories in certain ways, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So did Brophy and Saker, the detectives, do you think that they knew?
Sorry?
And that there were possible discussions being had around it with whoever was responsible? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, Brophy was a huge celebrity in Melbourne in the 30s. I mean, his career ended when he was shot. He was actually shot in the Botanical Gardens in 1936. And that shooting of Brophy actually led to Thomas Blamey's resignation. It's another huge story. He was a major celebrity from the moment of the gun alley right through, even before gun alley, right through to his resignation in 1936. Saker actually became a racecourse detective. But yeah, look, major crimes sold newspapers.
Yeah.
And I know up here that the shark arm murder and the pajama girl, those sort of stories, they just keep getting brought up in the way that later crimes like the Beaumont children and the Wanda killings and the Graham Thorne kidnapping, those I was going to say celebrity, strong word, but those high profile crimes, they sell newspapers.
Yeah.
And that's why Phar Lap was on the front page in 1930 so often.
So I guess the theory is that particularly this Piggott letter with the ALD torn from the newspaper, that was the only threatening letter left in the file, as though they were leaving a kind of hint, maybe, that they did know.
I have to stress, we also researched Phar Lap's death, and we came up with what we believe was the reason that Phar Lap died. And we're convinced, and we have produced the evidence to, in our view, conclusively say what killed Phar Lap. The Phar Lap shooting is still a complete mystery.
Mm.
And our suggestion that the media were involved is, in our view, the best explanation. But we are not saying definitively that's what happened, because we can't. But nothing else makes sense.
No.
And, the Keish put forward the theory that Harry Telford organised it all himself because he wasn't happy with the police protection he was getting for the horse and he wanted more. So he created this crime to try and convince the police that he deserved more protection. And maybe that's true, but then that doesn't explain why he then took the horse off to Geelong that night of his own accord. Because all the police said, yeah, you take him out to Geelong and let us know if anything goes on. But it is one of the great mysteries of Australian life, the Phar Lap shooting.
And I guess that's all we really have, is we have theories that are better than others.
Yeah. So you showed the Phar Lap biography that we wrote, and I'm really proud of that as a definitive study of Phar Lap. The shooting, they shot Phar Lap, didn't they? It's a work of semi-fiction. And we basically, I have never had anyone give me a better explanation for the shooting than what we have suggested. And it kind of makes sense what we've suggested, but at the same time, we realise that it's not absolutely nailed it, because you can't. It's just,
You can't.
it's one of the great mysteries of Australia.
But interestingly, Tommy Woodcock, so the strapper, he in 1936 reckoned he knew who did it. He wrote a kind of piece in the Tasmanian Mercury and said that he knew, and he saw him at the races and he couldn't believe it was the same person. So
Tommy Woodcock, over the course of his life, provided many different explanations for both the shooting and the death. He did a series of stories in 1936, and they're sensational. And I wonder, I mean, I have in my working life ghosted people like Ricky Ponting and Ian Healy and Mike Whitney and the like. And sometimes subjects don't read their copy. And I'm not suggesting that necessarily that Tommy Woodcock didn't read the copy that was written by J.M. Rowan in 1936. But I just wonder if he would have been happy to go along with whatever was suggested, because in the years that followed, Tommy put different theories up as to who might have been responsible. And remember, at the time, Tommy Woodcock gave a police statement in 1930, which didn't fit with what he said in 1936. Okay. I think all Tommy's different explanations show is that he didn't know. He just didn't know what happened. And he was a young man. His skill was he was a great horseman, one of the great horsemen of Australian racing. And I think people shooting at him and then finding himself in America with his horse dying in his arms, that was outside his comfort zone.
And we are going to talk a little bit about Phar Lap's death a little bit later on. But I mean, the relationship between man and horse is historically a very special one. What was so unique about Tommy and Phar Lap's, or Bobby, as he affectionately called him? What do you think was so unique about their relationship?
Oh, I'm not sure if it was unique, but it was your classic example of a strapper just falling in love with his horse and the horse falling in love with his strapper. And the two, there's some great stories that Woodcock knew what made Phar Lap tick. And they did build a relationship, which is one of the most romantic in Australian sport. And it was nothing for Woodcock to sleep with the horse. He took over the training of the horse when he went to America. And he cared for the horse. But then he cared for the horse in the same way, as it was quite clear. He then became a trainer of some ability. He trained Oaks winners. Famously, he trained Reckless to run second in the Melbourne Cup. He seemed to have a great affinity with horses generally. But it was the fact that he had this wonderful relationship with the greatest horse we've ever seen that sort of elevates that relationship above all others. But quite clearly, he was an extraordinary horseman, and he knew horses as well as anyone.
Well, do you think Phar Lap's the greatest racehorse of all time? Your subline of this book certainly says so.
I do, yeah, I really do.
Horses, is he the best?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he won all the time, and he didn't just beat horses; he thrashed them. And it's interesting. Sometimes people say, "Oh, he didn't run against much," but he did run against horses like Night March and Amonis and Mollison, and then if you see the film of his win in America at Agua Caliente, it's the most extraordinary win by a horse ever. He misses the start, goes about 10 wide, just takes off on the back straight and beats a reasonable field, not a great field, but a reasonable field. He beats them easily. And one of my favourite Phar Lap stories concerns his win in the AJC Plate in Sydney in April 1930. It's the most amazing story because Jim Pike, his regular jockey, couldn't ride him because, Phar Lap, being a 3-year-old in a weight for age race, was only carrying, I think, about 7'10". So he had Billy Elliott rode him, and he just took off. Phar Lap took off on Billy Elliott, and he broke an amazing number of track records in winning by a long way. Was pulled up at the winning post, but still won by half a furlong. And quite famously, the jockey of Night March, who ran second, was called in for a steward's inquiry because the stewards said that he hadn't tried. And then Night March's jockey just pointed out that he had also broken the track record, even though he'd run second. And that was the end of the steward's inquiry. So I think Phar Lap was just a freak. I think we see them occasionally, very, very occasionally in sport. We saw it with Bradman. And I think that he stands out well ahead of the other great racehorses that we've seen over the years, from, horses like the Barb and Carbine right through to Winks. But I think Phar Lap's unique.
Okay.
And I am biased.
You're a Phar Lapophile, remember?
Absolutely.
Well, we might actually, we're getting close to the end and we do have to get in some questions. So we might actually take a quick look at the that Melbourne Cup, which he, of course, came back from a tumultuous few days and won quite convincingly. Let's hope this works. This is a bit of an experiment. So we'll see. Here we go here. And if you want to make any comments over the bid, then go ahead, Geoff. But this is a tri-view view of the last few seconds of the Melbourne Cup of 1930 from the National Film and Sound Archive. Here we go.
Because the thing with this is that Phar Lap is carrying 9 stone 10, which was a record weight for a 4-year-old. So he's carrying a lot of weight. It is true that it's not a great Melbourne Cup field. There were some good horses. Tragilla and Balloon King was the Victoria Derby winner. And the horse that ran third, Shadow King, ran a place in 3 or 4 Melbourne Cups. But it was not a great field. But it's as dominant a Melbourne Cup win as you can imagine. The other thing that I find interesting about this is the number of people who are watching from outside the course or inside the course, and the relatively few people on the grandstand side, which is just a reflection of the times. The fact is, if you could save a few, Bob, you would. The other thing I would point out there is just Phar Lap's jockey, Jim Pike, was an extraordinary jockey, one of the greatest jockeys Australia's ever had. That photo is actually from the Derby, when he won the Victoria Derby. And it's the one we chose for the cover of the book, and it just shows what an extraordinary athlete Phar Lap was. And he was a 3-year-old. He was a quite precocious 3-year-old. But what I also love about that photo is just how absolutely calm Pike, the jockey, is. Phar Lap, the racehorse, is quite excited, which horses shouldn't be at the start of a 1.5-mile race. But Pike, the jockey, he looks in control, and I just love that about that photograph.
And of course, that is the morning of the shooting, so he would have been
that's Derby Day,
excitable given what had happened.
Oh. No, that's actually from Derby Day in 1930, I think. 1929, sorry.
Oh, is it? There you
I
go.
think, yeah.
Update that. All right. So before we get on to sort of wrapping up questions and also having a little bit of a chat about Phar Lap's death, that infamous incident, I just wanted to bring up this picture because this image of Phar Lap walking down a suburban street has always been attributed to it being in Melbourne. And we went on this massive research deep dive trying to find out where it was actually photographed. We thought it might have been around the Caulfield racecourse, but we actually put it out to our readership of Glenara News, which is our local council rag. And we had Mitch, who advised us that his father or grandfather was Billy Elliott, who donated the saddle to Melbourne Museum in their collection of Phar Lap saddle. And he advised us that this was actually in Randwick, so this picture. So we might have to let the National Library of Australia. So this photo here was probably taken a couple of seconds after this one. So we do know, and this is Phar Lap arriving for his spring racing campaign in Randwick. So there you go. That was a little bit of a mystery solved by a bit of crowdsourcing info. So there you go. So
it is one of the joys of Trove, if I can interrupt for a sec.
Yes.
That so many photos have been miscaptioned over the years. That the photos of Phar Lap being spirited into the van to be taken to the course, they were for years were shown as being Phar Lap at St Albans Stud, getting ready to go to back to Melbourne to Flemington on Cup Day. But it's only when you find them in the press reports that they were actually on the Saturday, which makes much more sense that the press would have been at Joe Cripps's stables at the time and ready to take those photographs, whereas they wouldn't have been at Geelong. But I find time and time again, I'm off topic now, but I found this wonderful photo of Don Bradman, which for years was said was from 1946, but it's actually from the day he scored his 100th 100 in 1947. And you can prove that because it was on the front page of The Sun that day. And
we talk about Phar Lap being a national treasure, Phar Lap being a national treasure, but I think Trove is for what it's done for researchers, at-home researchers or academic researchers like yourself. It's changed everything, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I can remember. It's just astonishing what you can discover in 5 seconds that used to take 5 weeks. You have to go to the library and plough through microfilm or plough through hard copy, hoping for a snippet. And then, now it's Trove is just the most extraordinary thing.
Extraordinary. Right, we're going to talk about Phar Lap's death now. There has been many theories that have been floated through the years about what killed Phar Lap. I think arsenic is the most popular one. But you have extensively researched this and you have your own conclusions. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Well, what we did when we first decided to publish the Phar Lap biography, our intention was essentially to put out all the different theories as to what killed Phar Lap, because our research showed that there was no definitive. It had never been nailed. The suggestion of arsenic was one. The gangsters did it. But what we did, and I must say my co-author Peter Thompson did this, he said, well, why don't we show the post-mortem to one of Melbourne's leading vets and get his reaction? And so a man, John Van Wiedendaal, who was a wonderful veterinary surgeon, one of the leading vets in Melbourne racing, or in Australian racing, he took one look at the post-mortem and said, that's duodenitis proximal gurginitis. And we said, of course it was. And what that is it's a bacterial infection that attacks the gut of a horse and essentially shuts down the intestines. And where this was really interesting, well, first, it was something that wasn't discovered until the early 1980s. So it didn't exist in the 1930s. But that cutting you have in front, the second part where it goes, Dr. Nielsen, the Australian veterinary surgeon, conducted an autopsy and certified that death was due to acute enteritis. Now, acute enteritis is a blocking of the intestine. Now, what they would have expected when they cut open the horse at the post-mortem would have been to find a blockage of the intestine, and that would have solved everything. But when they went in there was no blockage, because what duodenitis proximal gurginitis does is it has the bacterial infection has the same effect as a blockage. But when the vets in 1932 went looking for that and it wasn't there, they didn't know what the problem was. And that then allowed, basically that they had to say was, well, we don't know. And that then allowed all the different theories to just take off. And one of the most interesting, the suggestion was that he was killed by arsenic. And the only problem with suggesting that Phar Lap was killed by arsenic was that when they did the post-mortem, they checked for exactly that. And they decided conclusively that arsenic could not have been the cause of the horse's death. It's just not possible. And we had this ridiculous situation in about 2007 where people used a machine called the synchrotron, and they studied hair samples of Phar Lap, which apparently proved that arsenic had been involved. But there are other explanations for how arsenic could have got into the hair. And again, it doesn't come back to the fact that when Phar Lap died, he didn't show the signs of a horse that had been poisoned by arsenic, and also that irrefutable fact that they checked for arsenic poisoning at the time, and they said that it wasn't the cause. There was a skerrick of arsenic in his system, but trainers in those days used to give racehorses tonics that included a bit of arsenic. But the amount of arsenic that was in Phar Lap's system was basically the equivalent of a test tube when you needed a bucket to kill the horse.
And because of that, there was some bit of shade thrown at Tommy Woodcock at the time, wasn't there?
Well, that was the thing, because the suggestion was that Phar Lap was receiving this tonic that included some arsenic. So the theory was that Tommy Woodcock had essentially overdosed the horse by giving him too much tonic. But we know Tommy Woodcock was a great horseman who loved the horse. And there is absolutely no way that someone as fine a horseman as Tommy Woodcock could have made such a grievous and simple error as to essentially kill his horse by giving it too much tonic. It's just, it doesn't make sense. And there was this great mystery for so long, but when we showed the post-mortem to Dr. Van Wiedendaal, and he said it was duodenitis proximal gurginitis, which I can never say. And then what we did when we published the more recent edition of Phar Lap, I approached the leading veterinary toxicologist in America and did the same process without saying, what do you think? And I showed her the post-mortem, and she came back with exactly the same conclusion. Now, the problem we have is that saying not only can you not pronounce it, but no one can pronounce duodenitis, proximal jersonitis. It's not sexy to say that Phar Lap was killed by a bacterial infection. It just isn't. It's much groovier to say he was poisoned by gangsters. And so it has been impossible for us to convince the wider community that we're right. A New Zealand author published a book about Phar Lap years after we published our first edition, and he came to the same conclusion. Nowadays, anyone that actually looks at the evidence says, yeah, that's what happened. But unfortunately, the people who are more keen to have a decent headline and sensationalise Phar Lap's death, they still go with the arsenic killed him, or they say arsenic might have killed him, but it's never been resolved. In our minds, it has been resolved.
I guess wherever Phar Lap goes, intrigue and storytelling follows, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. Look, he's entered folklore like no other horse. And it's interesting that 2 years after Phar Lap died, Peter Pan won the Melbourne Cup, and people said that Peter Pan was the best horse since Phar Lap. And then there was a horse called Ajax in the late 30s, won numerous races in a row, and they said he was the best horse since Phar Lap. And so it was with Burnborough and Tulloch and Kingston Town and Black Caviar. And with Winks, when Winks emerged, that Winks wasn't the best horse since Black Caviar or the best horse since Kingston Town. Winks was the best horse since Phar Lap. Yeah. And when the next great horse turns up, that horse will be the best horse since Phar Lap. Phar Lap's in the language, and the reason for that, I think, is because he was just better than anyone else.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to some questions in a minute, and we're probably going to run a little bit over time. So apologies if people have to run off, but we will be popping this back up on YouTube. So you will be able to watch it a bit later if you do need to head off. Just a little bit of a plug for Geoff's books. I think you're still copies of They Shot Phar Lap, didn't they, available from Stokehill?
I have a few. Yes, I do. There are a few copies of that one left, and we do have some copies of the biography as well.
Wonderful. And you're on Twitter as well?
I am at Armstrong 61. Yeah.
Wonderful.
No, I've got to stress, I never criticise anyone. That is my policy.
Great.
And I get blown away by the people on Twitter who do.
Oh, Twitter's a funny place, so I avoid it.
It's
all right, we're going to get to some questions, and first question is from Juliana. You may not know this, Geoff, but let's ask anyway. Who decided to stuff Phar Lap and bring him back to the museum? How on earth were they able to do it back those years ago? Great job by the brothers, by the way. And by the brothers, she's referring to the Jonas brothers, who were the New York-based taxidermists who stuffed Phar Lap in 1932, I believe. Do you know who?
Basically, the owner of Phar Lap, David Davis, he agreed to send the skeleton to New Zealand, and that's in Wellington. And he decided to have the horse stuffed by the stuffed hide done by Jonas brothers, who I think are in New York. And then it was transported back to Australia. And again, it's a reflection of just they didn't do this for anyone else. And the horse, there's a wonderful photo of Phar Lap in display. I think at Belmont. It might not be Belmont, but I think in a New York racecourse. And then he was brought back to Australia, and I think the Phar Lap exhibit opened in maybe the end of 1932 or in 1933. And it's been a staple ever since. And it's almost like when you go to Melbourne, you have to go and see Phar Lap.
Absolutely.
And it is true, they did a most extraordinary job. And it's every time I go to Melbourne, I go and check it out. It's wonderful.
It's beautiful. So this is a little article here that actually talks about the donation from the owners to the Melbourne Museum, and that it was drawing an average of 430 visitors a day since it opened in 1933, which I think speaks to the place that Phar Lap holds in people's hearts. So the next question is from Anonymous, but were you a history buff or sports buff first? So do you not distinguish the two? How do you work that relationship out in your head?
I only do sport. Look, sport is my passion. and sporting history is what I am really into. I actually get blown away by how the great sporting stories, they're connected in different ways to the wider Australian story. And I mean, that's part of the magic of Phar Lap, that he fits into Australian history, the history of the Depression, and the way, the public reacted to that really, really difficult time. And the fact is that Phar Lap emerged first as a champion racehorse in the spring of 1929 when the Depression hit. And he is part of the wider Australian history rather than just sporting history. But no, my expertise, for what it's worth, is in sport. It's one of those scary things that when I did my HSC, I didn't read any of the novels I was supposed to read, but I did read Rugby League Week and Cricketer Magazine and read the form guide every week.
There you go. You knew where you were headed.
Jane Austen didn't do it for me, but horse racing certainly did.
Oh, yes. Now, Maggie asks, the public reaction to Phar Lap's death must have been so significant at the time. How did people bounce back? I could only imagine how sad it would have been. I mean, the outpouring of grief would have been quite astonishing, I imagine.
It was quite remarkable. You had people doing poems. They made a newsreel of him. It was certainly front page news. In fact, one of the interesting things about Phar Lap in general history is that there was a very important High Court case was due to be announced on the day that Phar Lap died, and the first edition of the Sydney papers, and I'm sure the Melbourne papers as well, came out with the High Court case, the resolution of this High Court case being announced. And then the second edition, which came out only about half an hour later, had the story of Phar Lap, which meant that Joe Lyons, the Prime Minister of the time, had to share the stage with Phar Lap. And as the story goes, when the Joe Lyons came out for his press conference about this High Court case, the first question he was asked was about a racehorse. And for right through that year, through 1932, I think Australians took a long while to come to grips with the fact that Phar Lap was dead, because he was going to be the Australian racehorse, even though he was born in New Zealand, so in a sense he's a New Zealand horse. But he was going to be the horse that put Australian racing on the map, and instead he died.
Have we stolen Phar Lap though from New Zealand? We like to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Good.
We share him, and it's this Phar Lap race
like
course.
The Pavlova, we share him with the Pavlova. Question from Stephen: didn't Tommy Woodcock say it was arsenic poison? What was Tommy's theory about the death?
No, Tommy didn't know. The best quote we got when we did the book was we spoke to Bill Stutt, who was a close friend of Tommy Woodcock's. He was a major racing official at Moonee Valley, and we said to Bill Stutt, "Did Tommy ever tell you what happened?" And Bill Stutt said the truth was Tommy didn't know, and that was why Tommy at one point did say that Phar Lap was poisoned, but I don't know whether he ever specifically said arsenic poisoning. But he did suggest that Phar Lap was poisoned because he didn't know. He was looking for an explanation like everybody else. And the reality is that the disease that we say killed Phar Lap, it wasn't discovered until the 1980s. So when they went into the autopsy looking for a solution, what they really needed was a time machine. Yeah. And that was all if they wanted to find out in 1932 what killed Phar Lap, that's the best thing they could have hoped for.
Can you say it again? What killed him? Say it again.
Duodenitis, proximal jeugenitis.
Right, easy.
It is easy. It rolls off the tongue. It took me about 5 years.
Oh, I'm very impressed. Well, we've actually run over time. I could continue talking to you for ages, Geoff, but we do have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for sharing this great yarn. It is such a wonderful story, and I think, really speaks to how important Phar Lap is in our national consciousness and our history, and how it's just almost taken on a world of its own. The stories and the intrigue surrounding this horse is incredible. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Look, I could talk about the horse forever, and it is the most wonderful Australian story in so many ways.
It's wonderful.
And can I just thank everyone who tuned in to listen to us, because I really appreciate that. That's fantastic.
And as I said, this will stay up on YouTube. If you missed a little bit, you missed the first half, you missed the second half, and we will send a link around to all booked participants in case you missed it. But thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.